Happy Sunday, and thank you for joining me on this episode of the Jeremiah Patterson Show. In 1872, Ulysses Grant was reelected president. Ulysses Grant was reelected president. If you're wondering why I left at the S there, that was not inadvertent. It's because there was not supposed to be an S in his name. In fact, it turns out that was inadvertently added when he was at an army camp. Google it. It's pretty fascinating. When President Grant ran for president in 1868, he won that election, becoming the 18th president of the United States. And it was a time during our country was in turmoil. It was just a chaotic time. President Grant had had no political office before then. Nonetheless, he had had no political experience. But when he was elected, it was sort of this jubilant occasion because the American people were hoping that he could put an end to the turmoil in the nation. I mean, we had just been through the Civil War. President Lincoln had been assassinated. President Johnson had gotten impeached, and racism was still prevalent because slavery had ended. So they thought that if we elect this guy in office, if we put this guy in office, I mean, Ulysses Grant, he was a general in the Union Army, and he led the Union Army to victory. And so he was so looked at as sort of this great, iconic American that could get our country back up and running. That didn't work out. It turns out that there were at least 12 scandals under the Grant administration. But among those 12 scandals, there are 2 scandals in particular that caught my eye as far as like an intrinsically historical lesson that we can use today as a historical analogy. All right, here's the first one. In 1875, Attorney General George H. Williams was supposed to prosecute a merchant house called Pratt & Boyd. This particular house was supposed to be prosecuted for custom house entries. Later on, the Senate Judiciary Committee looked into this matter and found out that the Attorney General had dropped the case abruptly. Oh my gosh, that's a bit odd. Why is that? What made the Attorney General drop this case? Was there any political interference from the president at the higher level, at the toppest levels of the federal government, at the highest levels of the federal government? Was there any political interference? Who asked him directly? Who asked him, or more directly, what made the Attorney General want to drop this case? Or what was promised to the Attorney General? And so, as the Senate Judiciary Committee looked into this matter and they kept investigating this matter, boom, they got the answer. It turned out that the Attorney General's wife, had got $30,000 as a payoff to keep silent and drop the case. And that was a bribe. And $30,000 in 1875 is worth more than $699,000 today. So back in 1875, $30,000 was a lot of money. However, that is corruption. So... And that's considered a bribe. So yeah, that was an enormous check. But after this ignominious event happened, President Grant was informed about it, and he thenceforth forced his Attorney General out of office. But there's more. The Attorney General had also been carelessly using DOJ funds to pay for a carriage and household expenses. Busted. Because when you use your public office for personal convenience and extravagant uses to benefit yourself and your family and to take yourself on like little vacations or something, when you use your public office and taxpayers' dollars to do those things, that is delineated as corruption. Therefore, it cannot be tolerated. So that's scandal number 1. That's the one that caught my eye. Here's scandal number 2. The whiskey ring. In June of 1874, the heat started to turn up a bit. Benjamin Bristol had resigned as the Secretary of Treasury, so President Grant replaced him with Mr. William Richardson. When the former Secretary of Treasury, Benjamin Bristol, found out about the whiskey ring, he made it his mission to end it immediately. Here's how History.com writes part of that story. Quote, with the help of undercover investigators and informants in various cities across the country, Bristol secretly assembled a case against the whiskey ring before arresting more than 300 suspected ring members in May of 1875. End quote. So, the next month, President Grant appointed a special prosecutor named John B. Henderson to investigate this matter. When Henderson got into office, he immediately got to work, wasn't playing around. He started working with U.S. attorneys and handed out multiple indictments all across St. Louis, Missouri. And when you dig deeper and really get to the heart of something, and you really get to the bottom of something, and you really want to find out the answer, and you keep asking questions and you keep looking around, that will eventually produce substantial evidence. So as John Henderson, this new special prosecutor appointed by President Grant, as John Henderson is looking into this matter, are you ready? He discovers a trail of evidence that leads directly to President Grant's cabinet. Oh my gosh. His personal secretary, and it turns out his personal secretary and longtime friend, General Orville Babcock, according to History.com, McDonald allegedly sent Babcock expensive gifts to dissuade the White House from inquiring into the scheme. And U.S. attorneys found that out. They found telegrams between Babcock and McDonald that appeared to be written in code. And this was bad because McDonald was the head of the IRS. So the head of the IRS is evidently corrupt. So McDonald has been sending Babcock expensive gifts to dissuade the White House from asking about this scheme, and U.S. attorneys found telegrams between Babcock and McDonald that appeared to be written in code, in secret, so no one would figure this thing out. So, in any movie about corruption, this is like the wow moment. This is where you get up and you make another bag of popcorn, because you're getting into the good part. And so, when the president was told about this, he initially accepted the investigation's finding. He said, quote, let no guilty man escape if it can be avoided, end quote. Nevertheless, Babcock somehow managed to convince the president that that he was innocent and this whole thing was a witch hunt, and that prosecutors were politically motivated, and Bristol was trying to use this as a chance to win the Republican presidential nomination. He was trying to use this to gear up his chances, to bolster his chances to win the White House. And so in December of 1875, when Babcock was indicted on charges of defrauding the government, when he was in court, he did something that was almost inconceivable. And with the president's reaction was also inconceivable. These things were both astonishing. They were both in order. They both happened almost immediately after it transpired. But it's very astonishing of what had just happened. So let's back up here before I tell you what happened. So John B. Henderson is appointed as special prosecutor to look into this matter, to look into the whiskey ring. You have Babcock here, and you also have the head of the IRS with public corruption here. Then you have former Secretary of Treasury Benjamin Bristol. He resigned as Secretary of Treasury. He finds out about whiskey ring, and he makes it his goal to just end this scheme, in this public corruption scheme, and throw these people in jail. And so in December of 1875, John B. Henderson finally indicts Babcock. And so Babcock was indicted on charges of defrauding the government. It turns out that when Babcock was in court, he decided to flip on the president. Told everything. He indicated that there was possible interference by the president. It wasn't just me. The president played a role in this thing too. The president was enraged and ordered his attorney general to fire special prosecutor John Henderson immediately. Get him out of there. And so the attorney general executed the president's orders, and Henderson is out. Apparently, the rationale for why the president abruptly fired Henderson was because of the cabinet's, quote, outrage. The firing of special prosecutor John Henderson outraged Democrats. And the first special prosecutor in the nation to be fired. The first special prosecutor in the nation. This whole thing, when President Grant fired this special prosecutor for looking into this matter, for doing the right thing, for looking into this, thinking about it ethically. When the president fired Henderson, this did set off lots of alarms and also lots of public outcry. Why did the president fire Henderson? Is what Babcock said in court true? Did the president play a role in this public corruption scheme called the Whiskey Ring? Who knew about it? Who was involved? What happened? Why did it take place? And why wasn't the head of the IRS out? I mean, these were questions that were asked back then, and apparently the president of the United States got so mad that he kicked Henderson out. He fired him. When Henderson himself was asked about why the president fired him, or why he was fired by the president of the United States, he told the New York Herald, quote, "I can only account for it by Grant's madness and desire for revenge on hearing of the indictment of General Babcock," end quote. Now, also remember, General Babcock is one of his friends. General Babcock is one of President Grant's friends. In fact, one newspaper mocked the president's own words, saying, quote, "He apparently meant, 'Let no guilty man escape unless he lives in the palace,' end quote. Essentially saying, oh, if you are the president's friends, well, you're not guilty. You're automatically innocent. And therefore, you live in the palace with me, so you are clear. You are vindicated. No more investigations into my friend." President Grant also blamed the press and demanded that they be put on a grand jury to corroborate their stories. He also tried to stop prosecutors from giving immunity to witnesses in return for their testimony. So at this point, the president has gone wild. He has just done something that is completely outlandish, preposterous, astonishing, and inconceivable. He's using the Justice Department to protect his friends and to punish his enemies. There's no line that President Grant will not cross. Oh, have we heard that before? His Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, said that the president had reached a stage of paranoia. The president complained that, quote, "the prosecution was aimed at himself and that they were putting him on trial, end quote. Ronald Schaefer from the Washington Post writes, quote, "Meanwhile, Grant remained adamant that his old friend Babcock was innocent. He stunned colleagues at a cabinet meeting when he said he was going to go to St. Louis to testify at Babcock's trial, essentially to defend his friend. Instead, both sides agreed to question the president at the White House in February of 1876. It was the only time that a sitting U.S. president has testified in a criminal trial." Wow. End quote. So the president got so infuriated with this whole thing, and it was shocking. It was very shocking. And he shockingly offered to testify in St. Louis, Missouri, to defend his friend because his friend was innocent. Well, it turns out that worked. And it was in part because the president himself went down to St. Louis, Missouri, and testified. The jury, subsequently, acquitted the clearly guilty Babcock. However, he would later be forced to resign his White House role. He was really the only major target of this probe to go free and, live a happy life, vindicated, even though deep inside he knows he's guilty. Later on, prosecutors convicted more than 100 men and redeemed more than $3 million in stolen tax revenue. Some Democratic newspapers suggested that the president be charged with obstruction of justice, but he was never touched. That the president be charged with obstruction of justice. That the president be charged. I mean, why would these Democratic newspapers say that the president be charged with obstruction of justice? Well, turn the page a bit. Look back at this why. So Babcock is one of the president's friends. The president decided to intervene in this Justice Department case just to save his friend, Babcock. That is obstruction of justice. That obstructs the special prosecutor, John Henderson, from doing his job and fully prosecuting Babcock and making sure that Babcock gets put away and goes to jail for what he did. But yeah, the president obstructed justice knowingly and conspicuously. And so that is the story of President Ulysses S. Grant, or excuse me, should I say Ulysses Grant, firing a special prosecutor in 1875. As Ronald Schaefer writes at the Washington Post, quote, "The heat was turning up," end quote. Well, if you fast forward 145 years later, you end up here in 2020. Earlier this week, Jeffrey Berman, the former attorney for the Southern District of New York, that was fired by the Attorney General at the president's request, testified to the House Judiciary Committee. Here's PBS NewsHour.
The ousted U.S. attorney in Manhattan was interviewed today by the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. Jeffrey Berman had been leading probes of President Trump's associates when he was forced out. He told lawmakers that Attorney General William Barr offered him another position to leave of his own accord. Afterward, Democratic Committee Chair Jerry Nadler was sharply critical.
The Attorney General repeatedly attempted to entice Berman to step down voluntarily, even after Berman made clear that his leaving would disrupt certain sensitive cases. We don't know yet if the Attorney General's conduct is criminal, but that kind of quid pro quo gets awfully close to bribery.
Also earlier this week, Roger Stone, the President of the United States, President Donald Trump, commuted Roger Stone's sentence. That essentially means that Roger Stone will not go to jail. It is not necessarily a pardon. That does not necessarily mean that Roger Stone is vindicated and that he will no longer be looked into, but that essentially means that Roger Stone does not go to jail. Back in November of 2019, Roger Stone was found guilty on 7 counts. Was found guilty on 7 counts of WikiLeaks connections and also interference with Russia during the 2016 presidential elections. And so that is messed up. That is not good. It's not good to interfere with a foreign country in the middle of a presidential election to diametrically benefit yourself as a presidential candidate and hurt the other candidate's chances of winning the White House as well. I mean, that is part of our republic. The people have the right to vote. That person is voted into office, not with the help of a foreign power to get you into office. Robert Mueller, the former special counsel, he served as the special counsel for the U.S. Justice Department from 2017 to 2019, looking into the Russia investigation matter, looking to see if there was interference by the Russian government in 2016. Roger Stone commented about he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about Roger Stone Roger Stone's sentence being commuted. He wrote here, quote, "The work of the special counsel's office, its report, indictments, guilty pleas, and convictions should speak for itself, but I feel compelled to respond both to broad claims that our investigation was illegitimate and our motives were improper, and to specific claims that Roger Stone was a victim of our office. The Russia investigation was of paramount importance. Stone was prosecuted and convicted because he committed federal crimes. He remains a convicted felon, and rightfully so." Russia's actions were a threat to America's democracy. It was critical that they be investigated and understood. By late 2016, the FBI had evidence that the Russians had signaled to a Trump campaign advisor that they could assist the campaign through the anonymous release of information damaging to the Democratic candidate, which was Hillary Clinton. And the FBI knew that the Russians had done just that. Beginning in July of 2016, WikiLeaks released emails stolen by Russian military intelligence officers from the Clinton campaign. Other online personas using false names, France for Russian military intelligence, also released Clinton campaign emails. End quote. So if you just pause there, this is the part. This is also when in July of 2016, when then candidate Trump says, "Russia, if you are listening, take a look at my opponent's emails and see what you can find." It continues, quote, Following FBI Director James B. Comey's termination in May of 2017, the acting attorney general named me as special counsel and directed the special counsel's office to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. The order specified lines of investigation for us to pursue, including any links or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign. One of our cases involved Roger Stone, an official on the campaign until mid-2015, and a supporter of the campaign throughout 2016. Stone became a central figure in our investigation for two reasons. He communicated in 2016 with individuals known to us to be Russian intelligence officers. He claimed He claimed advanced knowledge of WikiLeaks' release of emails stolen by those Russian intelligence officers. End quote. So this essentially is saying. So Robert Mueller is essentially saying in this new op-ed from the Washington Post, or Robert Mueller writing in the Washington Post, he's essentially saying that Roger Stone had prior information that WikiLeaks was about to release these emails. He already knew. He continues on, quote, we now have a detailed picture of Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election. The special counsel's office identified two principal operations directed at our office: hacking and dumping Clinton campaign emails, and an online social media campaign to disparage the Democratic candidate. We also identified numerous links between the Russian government and Trump campaign personnel. Stone was among them. We did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired with the Russian government and its activities. The investigation did, however, establish that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome. It also established that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts. Uncovering and tracing Russian outreach and interference activities was a complete task. Then it continues. We're going to move on to this part now. Quote, Congress also investigated and sought information from Roger Stone. A jury later determined he lied repeatedly to members of Congress. He lied about the identity of his intermediary to WikiLeaks. He lied about the existence of written communications with his intermediary. He lied about denying he had communication with the Trump campaign about the timing of WikiLeaks releases. He, in fact, updated senior campaign officials repeatedly about WikiLeaks, and he tampered with a witness, imploring him to stonewall Congress. The jury ultimately convicted Stone of obstruction of a congressional investigation, 5 counts of making false statements to Congress, and tampering with a witness. Because his sentence has been commuted, he will not go to prison, but his conviction stands. End quote. Once again, Robert Mueller writing this op-ed, this remarkable op-ed in the Washington Post. The headline reads, quote, Roger Stone remains a convicted felon, and rightfully so. Just because the President of the United States says, hey, Roger, I commuted your sentence. You don't get to go to jail, buddy. I got you, friend. He remains a convicted felon, and rightfully so. The president doesn't get to change that. Also, earlier this week, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman retired, citing a campaign of bullying and retaliation from the President of the United States. Vindman testified, if you recall, Vindman testified to the House Intelligence Committee during the impeachment trial. I want to play now this clip of Alexander Vindman during the House Intelligence Committee impeachment trial, essentially telling his dad, hey, Dad, you don't have to worry. I will be safe. I will be okay for telling the truth in this country. I will be okay. I know you have heard that part, but I want to play the part where it started. Here's that clip now.
Next month will mark 40 years since my family arrived in the United States as refugees. When my father was 47 years old, he left behind his entire life and the only home he had ever known to start over in the United States so his 3 sons could have a better and safer lives. His courageous decision inspired a deep sense of gratitude in my brothers and myself and instilled in us a sense of duty and service. All three of us have served or are currently serving in the military. My little brother sits behind me here today. Our collective military service is a special part of our family's history, a story in America. I'm grateful to for my father's brave act of hope 40 years ago and for the privilege of being an American citizen and public servant, where I can live free of fear for mine and my family's safety. Dad, I'm sitting here today in the U.S. Capitol talking to our elected professionals is proof that you made the right decision 40 years ago to leave the Soviet Union and come here to the United States of America in search of a better life for our family. Do not worry. I will be fine for telling the truth. Thank you again for your consideration. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Once again, that was Alexander Vindman, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. Apparently telling the truth in this country is bad, because if you do, the President of the United States will come after you, especially if it pertains to himself. Meanwhile, as far as the rule of law, the attorney for the Eastern District of New York was also fired earlier this week. Courthouse News writes, quote, instead of defiantly refusing to leave his post, ex-U.S. Attorney Richard Donahue accepted a promotion to Main Justice, where he and Barr's now former Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General Seth Ducarme will trade places. End quote. So Barr has not installed his own guy in there. This news is exasperating and another horrifying erosion for the rule of law. Every single day, not just the rule of law, but our republic is eroding drastically under this administration. And we as citizens have seen it. We as citizens have to rise up and fix this before our republic is no more. As Benjamin Harrison, this last thing I want to end off before we go to commercial break. As Benjamin Harrison is leaving the Constitutional Convention, he was asked, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy? Benjamin Franklin turned around and he answered this, quote, a republic, if you can keep it, end quote. The alarms have already sounded. The alarms have sounded loud enough. We are all up. The president was acquitted in the Senate, and apparently impeachment has taught him nothing because he thinks he can get away with anything. This is a new test for us as Americans to save our republic, to save our nation that was founded 244 years ago by our founding fathers. This is a new test for us as Americans, the fight to save our republic and uphold the rule of law.